That's because it's not true. It's a rock fact.
How I made this. So what you're seeing right now is a small stop motion animation, and this is Greg from Over the Garden Wall, and I'll be showing you how I made this. Hi, I'm Chris, and my job is making stop motion animations, puppets, and props. And I'm here to share some of my knowledge with you all. And keep watching to find out where you can find a free 3D printed armature that you can print off and use for stop motion animation. So this little guy is Greg. He's a little stop motion puppet and he's fully posable. And then right here, you can see the size difference here in this picture. I'm pretty sure he's the smallest figure I've ever made, and I've got a larger, more detailed version of the making of these characters in a longer video. If you click off now, it will destroy how well this video does, so please don't do that. So getting back to the little stop motion figure, this puppet is made from lots of replacement parts that are all 3D printed, which I've sculpted and painted myself. Then it has a wire armature inside and little hand sewn clothes, which were massive pain to make, but they look great. And this character makes use of quite a few replacement parts. And what I mean by that is these parts can be switched out to do a little bit of replacement animation as I'm animating. So these replacement parts are the blinks, are the hands, and are the mouths, which can be all animated through replacement animation. And that just means that we can take this little hand off here, we can put on a new one in a slightly different pose. All of these are magnetic, so they can be easily removed and replaced. So all of the 3D printed parts start their life in Blender, which is a really nice free software that you can sculpt quite nice things in. If people want to know more about my sculpting techniques, just comment below and I'll be able to make a video on that, because it is a subject that needs its own video because it is quite complex. So comment below if you want that video. Then what I've done is imported the 3D models into Fusion 360, which is a really good CAD software that I use quite a lot. If you want to get this for free, use the hobbyist license. And then what I do here is scale the parts to their correct size, so they're really accurate down to the millimeter and functional for animation. And what I mean by that is cutting a hole into the head that is going to be this little square hole, and this is going to let the neck slot into the head, but it also lets me slot this little handle inside the head, which will be super useful when I get around to painting. Plus, whilst I'm designing it in 3D, I'll add a little magnet hole. So the mouths that also have little magnet holes inside can be magnetized onto the face to make really nice, easy replacement animation for the mouths. And once I'm happy with these 3D designs, what I'm going to do is 3D print them, and I'm going to be 3D printing them in resin for a super high quality print, and a really nice smooth quality since my printer is a 8K resolution printer. And you get little advantages like sculpting these in Blender is that you're able to make near identical copies, but have small alterations based on the placement of the bottom teeth and their shape, which is super useful to getting nice open mouths, just closing them a little bit, just so when you're animating you can get nice small movements if you really wanted to. But moving on from there, what I'm going to do is go on to the fun part, which is talking about the painting of the character. Like I said earlier, you can slot this wood stick into the head and use it as a handle for when you're painting. I'm going to use this right now to kind of keep it suspended in the air whilst I spray paint the head with some primer. This will act as a really good foundation for my paint to bond onto. The paint I'm using today is Vallejo model paint. So I'm using a custom mix of this model paint, where I'm using a very watered down version of these paints. And that's just so when I start to paint the surface, I don't leave any brush marks. Moving on to the mouths, what I'm going to do is use the exact same technique to paint these. It is a little bit harder because of the size they are. You want to use a really small brush for this. Using a small brush will give you a bit more brush control over these smaller areas. And here's a little animation test showing how well these mouths actually work after they've been painted. As I said before, all of these mouths are magnetized, which means that you can take one off and put a new one on and it just snaps into place. The magnets that I'm using are 0.5 by 1mm. I'll include a link in the description of where I got those from. Then using a cocktail stick, what I'm doing is applying some super glue to the inside of this hole. Then I'm inserting the magnet into the hole using this little tool that I made. These are all the mouths that I've designed. I'm now going to do the exact same technique, but for the face this time, repeating all these steps again. To go into a little bit more detail, this magnet is a little bit larger. It is 1mm by 1mm. And this is because the head has a larger space available for the magnet, so I can actually have a larger magnet inside. And looking through this animation again, you can really tell how well this works. The magnets can be applied and taken off really easily. I'm really happy with how this came out, and I'm definitely going to repeat this process for another character. But now, what I'm going to do is go into some more detail about how I made these replacement hands. This again was made in Blender, but this time I've done it a little bit differently. What I did was add a little animatable bone to the hand model. This lets me go into the pose menu and alter and animate the hands by rotating them on these axes so I can pose the fingers how I want. And using this technique has let me make 32 pairs of hands, which is a really nice selection of hands that you can use as you're animating. All of these can be swapped out and replaced as I'm animating. All of these hands are made with little magnet holes, much like with the mouths, but a little bit different. But moving on from there, I do have this other prop that I made, just so he could talk about his little rock fact prop from the show. I did 3D print this, thinking that I could make it hollow and make it light enough to animate, but it did come out too heavy, so what I had to do was use a little rig to hold it in place, and kind of move that rig every time I animated. So painting this is the exact same process for when I painted the head and the mouths. But the mouth of the prop was a little bit too difficult to paint, so what I had to do is go in with a little pen. It was a little bit too small and I wanted it really clean, so I couldn't really do it with the brush. And then here's a little bonus, and this little bonus prop is Dwayne The Rock Johnson's head as the rock fact prop, so I thought that would be really funny. I really enjoyed myself making this one. So the head itself is off Thingiverse because I didn't see the point in sculpting a whole head just for this little joke, and added on Greg's little hands onto it, which then I dry brushed to make it actually look like a rock, to really pick out a lot of these highlight details. Then using my brush, what I'm doing is stifling the surface to add in a bit more texture. I still find this really funny, I just haven't gone around to actually animating it, which is a little bit annoying, but hopefully one day. Then moving on, what I'm going to do is paint the shoes. I've already painted the shoes a dark brown, so when I dry brush it, I get some nice highlights. And here's a little tip for doing dry brushing. If you build it up in several layers, so if you do some midtones and then some highlights, you can get a nice color range on these shoes. Just makes it look that little bit more weathered. So everything at this point is painted, so what I'm going to do is move on to spraying a layer of protection onto the paintwork, and stops the paint from getting scratched off. Really important, especially if it's getting handled by an animator. But before I do that, I need to do my little ad read. Today's video is not sponsored, but I do need to remind you to subscribe, like and comment if you're liking this video so far. And if you want me to make a specific video in the future, please comment that down below so I know what you actually want. And if you want to learn more about stop motion, I do have plenty of learning resources on my Patreon, like this free 3D printed armature that you could print off at home. But with all that said, back to the video. So I'm going to spray all this with a matte lacquer. This will protect the paint really nicely and stop any of the paint getting scratched as it's getting handled or animated. So you want to go over this quite a few times, maybe 3 times, so you get a nice coverage over the character. And I do this for all the parts, not just the face. I'm doing it for the mouths and hands and the blinks and everything. As you're doing this, make sure you spray the shoes. The shoes are the most likely thing to get damaged because they are the most at risk of getting ground on the table as they're getting animated in a walk cycle, or if the shoe's just getting turned around on the stage, get quite a bit of friction there and it will just rip the paint off. So yeah, spray this down with a matte lacquer. This will keep it nice and protected and stop the paintwork from getting damaged. Then, before we can move on to doing the clothing for the character, what we need to do is make the padding and the armature. So this is just a normal wire armature, apart from the 3D printed chest and the hips. So the armature, like everything else, was sculpted in Blender. Then afterwards what I did was put the 3D models into Fusion 360. This was just so I could add some functionality to the armature. And what I mean by this is inserting holes for the armature's wire to plug into. And then I've made these threaded areas where you can drive a screw through the armature and lock the wire in place. To protect the wire from being damaged from the screws, what I've done is made these little tubes. These fit perfectly into the armature. But before I can glue the wire into the tubing, what I need to do is actually twist the wire. I'm going to be twisting all this together using my drill. So for the arms and legs, I'm using aluminium wire, copper wire and steel wire. So after twisting all the wire together, what I've done is glued these wires into its tubing and started assembling the armature. Then to lock all the wires in place, what I'm doing is driving in these little screws. These are going down these little threaded channels. Then afterwards I glued and wrapped thread all around the armature This really helps in the next stage where we're padding out the character, where we're going to be gluing on some of the upholstery foam. And the glue that I'll be using to stick on the upholstery foam to the wire is Yoo-hoo glue. It's a really good contact adhesive and it dries relatively quite quickly. Then after leaving it to dry, what I'm doing is taking my little scissors and I'm just trimming off some of that sponge. This is just so when we apply the clothing later, there's enough padding to give the body some shape. This is what the character looks like after I've chopped away the foam, giving it a bit more shape. Then what I'm doing to smooth out the texture of this padding, what I'm doing is wrapping the body in this tiger wrap. It's a really nice light foam and you can just wrap it around, it will stretch around the body and it will round off all these harsh cut lines that we've got from trimming down the foam. It's a lot easier to apply onto the character if you trim these down into really thin strips. Then once I'm happy with how this is looking, what I'm going to do is add a little bit of Yoo-hoo glue. Then I'm putting in a little pin just to kind of pin this all in place. Once I've wrapped the body and the legs, I'm just testing how well the head fits onto the body, just slotting this on and seeing how well it fits. So if there's any issues, I can fix that now rather than later. Moving on, what I'm going to do is start talking about how I made the clothing for the character. So what I'm needing to do first is make a little clothes pattern template. To make the designs, I'm going to use some stick and seal. It's very similar to something like cellophane, but it's sticky on one side. So what I've done already is cut off a little tiny piece and I'm just offering it onto the character. You want to press this down so it seals around the arm. In this area where it's touching, that is going to be where our seam is for the sleeve that I'm going to be designing. To draw onto the plastic, I'm going to be using one of these blue Frixion pens. So I'm using these blue pens because you can erase the ink if you've made any errors. You just use a little bit of heat and the ink just kind of disappears. So I'm just drawing a generic sleeve pattern onto this plastic that can be copied over later on. And if you don't know what that looks like, you can look up a full-scale reference, one that would be used on real clothing for actual people, and obviously changing the scale and making it fit your character. Then once the design has been drawn out, I trace that onto some tracing paper. You do it this way so you can get a nice clean drawing of the template you've made and you can cut it out and place it over the fabric. And then I'm labeling which item of clothing it is. You want to do this for all the clothing parts. So I'm cutting this out so I can use it as a template on top of the fabric. So once it's all secured down, what I'm going to do is draw around this little template. And then to draw around the template, I'm using my Frixion pen again. So once I'm done sewing it together, I can just use an iron and that iron will just erase all of that pen work. As I'm drawing onto the fabric, I'm also including a bit more space on the sides. This just lets me have more room as I'm sewing down the side. Then once it's transferred across, what I'm doing is taking out the pins and cutting out the fabric around these lines that I've just drawn out. Then using a sewing needle, what I'm going to do is start sewing the fabric together, just slightly outside of that blue line. So I'm going to be sewing these inside out, which means that I can flip these around once I'm finished. So I can have a nice clean seam on the outside. Every so often, as I'm sewing this together, I'm just offering it up to the character, getting a good idea whether or not it fits or not. Then for the collar of the shirt, what I've done is cut out a new piece of white. So I've cut out a little square hole in the middle of this collar. This is just so it can slide over the top of this square neck tube. And then again, I'm just testing out how well the head fits on the body with this new collar. So before I glue down the collar, what I'm going to do is make this little necktie that is in this reference picture. Then I'm cutting out little strips of this black fabric. Then I'm gluing these down onto the shirt where the collar is going to go, so these will be quite hidden underneath. Then I'm just gluing the collar on top using some fabric glue. Then to secure this all in place, what I'm doing is gluing down these little ends of the necktie. Then for these little straps that go over the shoulder that are the overalls, I'm folding this over with a little bit of fabric glue inside, and I'm doing this because I want a nice thick piece of green fabric that I can fold over the shoulders. After cutting out some strips, what I'm doing is posing it on the character. Then once I'm happy with that, I'm just putting down some glue and I'm gluing it down. So I'm doing this really carefully. As I'm doing this, I'm being really careful. I don't want to smudge any of this glue over the surface because it will wreck the character's clothing right now. And then after gluing it, what I'm doing is just pinning it down, just so it's locked in place whilst it dries. And then I'm just trimming off this excess here. Then once again, adding some glue to glue it in place. And this is how it looks so far, so I'm going to repeat this for the next one. And when I was looking through references of this character, I found out they had a little functional bag, so obviously I had to make that. So I started by making a little strap on the bag, and that's just by getting some brown fabric, putting a little bit of glue inside, and then putting a strip of wire inside so that can be posed around the character. So the bottom of the bag is 2 semicircles that have been sewn together. Like everything else, this was sewn inside out, so I just flip this around. Then for the lid of the bag, I'm just going to slot this wire into the bag, just to kind of show you how this looks. And this lid of the bag is just a piece of wire that is in a U shape that I've glued some fabric onto and then trimmed to size. Then I'm just gluing this on. I'm just adding a bit of glue onto this wire, and then I'm placing it inside, being very careful not to get glue all over the inside of the bag. So to glue this on, I'm going to be using some Yoo-hoo glue. This is just so it gets glued on a little bit more securely. Then I'm just offering up this glued area onto the straps that we made earlier. Then to finish up the clothing, what I'm going to do is add on a few little extras like these little buttons. I'm just adding a little tiny piece of glue, then offering up the button to stick it on. I did make this on my 3D printer just because I wanted quite a few identical copies. I mainly printed these out just as a little test, just to see how small I could actually make these. I'm amazed by how small they came out and how good they look after being painted. So I'm just gluing a few more of these buttons onto the puppet. Then moving on, what I'm going to do is finally prep the character to be animated. And I'm just grabbing some tacky wax to put onto the pupils to make those animatable. It's a really nice sticky wax that helps bond little light objects onto surfaces. Then afterwards it can be just pressed up against the eye and it should stick on. I'm just repeating this for the other eye. And the benefit of using this wax is that you're able to move the pupil, making the eye look like it's looking in different directions. I can just drag this pupil around, make it look like it's looking in a new direction, but as a little fun note, this is actually really fun to play with. Now that's all done, what I'm going to do is go into a little bit of detail about how I animated the character. Like how I animated these blinks, which can be lifted off, switched for another one, and applied. And right here is an animated loop of the character blinking, and as well a zoomed in picture of all the different blinks that I use. So I 3D modelled these in 3D just so I could make a little negative shape of the eye in the back. And this just means that they fit the eye perfectly and can be placed on top. To help these blinks stick onto the eye, what you can do is scoop up a little bit of tacky wax using a sculpting tool, place it onto the inside of the blink, and then place it on the eye. That will really help it stick on. So because the wax is quite workable and posable, what you can do is angle these blinks to make the character look a little bit more emotive, and this just lets you have a bit more personality involved whilst animating. Then to animate the rest of the character, the arms and legs are all wire, so they're really nice and posable. And it poses really well because it's got aluminium wire inside, which is a really nice soft metal, which poses really well. Unfortunately, the Rockfect prop didn't quite work on Greg's wrist. It's a little bit too heavy, even though I printed it hollow. So I had to come up with a new solution to animate this, which meant that I had to connect it to a stop motion rig. But then what I had to do was animate the prop connected to the arm, but I found it was a little bit too awkward to do. So I ended up animating it with a little space between the two, just so when it came to it I had a bit more flexibility when animating the prop, so it wouldn't interfere with the arm too much. Even though there's this little gap, this is what it looks like when it's animated. And this really shows that it doesn't matter how it looks to your perspective. If it looks good to the camera and the audience's perspective, then everything's going to be fine. And this practical effect is used quite often by stop motion animators, like this shot of this pink character, where he chops his head off with a pair of scissors, but the character's head that we see get cut off is a completely different copy and the real head is just tucked away. It's just a little practical effect through the perspective of the camera, but watching through the animation you'd never notice, which is near enough the same technique that I used for this shot. Doesn't matter what you see, as long as it works through the camera's perspective and the audience's perspective, everything will work out. But moving on from there, I'm going to start talking about how I animated the hands through replacement animation. So all of these hands on the character are all magnetized and they can be just pulled off like this. And then I'm just placing on a new one and it's snapping right back into the original position of the previous one. So it perfectly lines up when compared. Each hand is very similar, but just a slightly different pose. I've made 64 hands altogether, that is 32 pairs. So because I had a pretty good idea of what poses I wanted these hands in, I did pre-design these. and I've designed these in several poses. One of the poses is a fist opening up into an open hand, another one where I've got a closed hand that points its finger out because I wanted to do a little bit of pointing in this animation, but I just knew I wanted this character pointing at the rock fact prop, so I made these two different designs so I could pick which one I wanted to use whilst I was actually animating. And this is what the hands looked like in the animation. You can see them going through all the different poses. And this was because I was mix and matching the sets as I was animating to get a nice expressive movement with those hands. So I could animate those hands being really expressive. Then for this stop motion rig that's in the background, I used a free software called DaVinci Resolve to edit this out. So I would go into a bit more detail about how I removed that stop motion rig, but to explain this in enough detail, it really has to be its own video. The video for that is located on my Patreon, and as well all the 3D printed files are located on there as well for this character that you can download and print off yourself, and there's plenty more to learn about stop motion on there. I hope you enjoyed this video, maybe give it a subscribe, like and comment, and if you want any more videos just comment down below, and have a great day.